Good evening. Welcome to my COVID-19 diaries that are rapidly coming to an end because my exile and isolation is about to end. Or I should say, it's about to be moved to another continent and country, and I presume that I'll continue to stay isolated. On the 14th, I'm flying back to Minneapolis by the way of Tokyo and Chicago. So my time in Ho Chi Minh City is coming to an end. So what do I want to talk about tonight? Uh, I was listening to this podcast, and it was about this. They interviewed this writer, Mark Hatton. You may remember him as a guy who wrote "The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night," which gained a huge, almost cult-like popularity, and a lot of stage things were done from it. Anyway, he was talking about his new book, and his new book is called Porpoise. And it is a retelling of the Shakespearean play Pericles. And as he was talking about this, he said, and I concur, that Pericles is probably the least popular, the least liked Shakespearean play that we know. Well, this made me think, well, what is the most popular Shakespearean play that we have? And then, this comes down to individual choice, as it should. So I said, well, whose choice should we talk about? It says, well, mine, of course. So my favorite Shakespeare play by a good country mile is King Lear. It could have been Hamlet, it could have been Julius Caesar, it could have been Macbeth, but no. It is, for me, King Lear is the ultimate Shakespearean play. Well, I should tell you one more thing. Of the Shakespearean plays, I've seen every one of them. I've read every single one of them multiple times. But my favorites tend to be tragedies. Comedies are okay, but it's the tragedies that I like. The history plays are fine, but for me, it's King Lear, Hamlet, Julius Caesar, Macbeth. So, King Lear. Why do I like King Lear? Well, first let me tell you something, my personal relationship with this play. The way I judge the performance of King Lear, and I have seen hundreds of performances of King Lear, from the Pier being performed on the, in Chicago at the Navy Pier, to small regional theaters around the country, big theaters in New York and London, and Shakespeare and other languages, movies. I mean, I've seen every possible production of King Lear, and the way I finally judge how good or effective production of King Lear is by the fact that whether it makes me cry or not. And I understand this is very subjective viewpoint, but here we are talking about what I like. So, the final scene in King Lear, here's a spoiler alert. If you've never seen King Lear or read King Lear, this may ruin the ending for you. But there's this scene at the end when this old king with his flowing gray hair and beard, in this, dressed in this robe, enters from the side of the stage, slowly, almost stumbling, carrying the body of Cordelia, his youngest and his favorite daughter, who's been hanged. And he lets out this howl, and this howl is like gut-wrenching, soul-wrenching, and the grief just pours out of this man's soul. There is such a visceral outpouring of grief that you are riveted in your seat, and if it's halfway decently performed King Lear, the tears are running down my face, quite shamefacedly. It makes me cry. There's something so sad about this. But how did we get here? So what is it? What gives power to King Lear, to this performance or this production or this thing that Shakespeare wrote? Well, it's a simple enough story. It's a story of a monarch at the absolute pinnacle of his powers. He decides that he wants to retire and he's going to take his kingdom and divide it up amongst his three daughters, uh, Regan, Goneril, and his youngest and favorite daughter, Cordelia, who, as this is going on, has two suitors for her hand in marriage. The king is an old, perhaps foolish, vain man. He doesn't realize that his majesty, his powers are derived from the kingdom that he has. He wants to give away his kingdom to his daughters and then still expect to have the same majesty, the same sway that he held when he was an absolute king. This is obviously not possible. I mean, if you're a very rich man, everybody loves you and they fawn at your feet, but once the money's gone, so are all those differences that you're used to. Well, King Lear gets his daughters out and brings them one by one and says, well, tell me what you think about me so that I might leave you the best part of my kingdom. And they just fawn over each other, basically telling this man that he's the only man in their lives and he's a fantastic person and how they love him. And so his ego is stroked, but he still saves for last the best part of his kingdom because he knows that of his three daughters, he has loved Cordelia the most. Cordelia is if you'll excuse the cliche, the apple of his eye. And so he can't imagine what Cordelia is going to sing in his praises, because his other two daughters, who are his daughters, but he's not particularly fond of, but they have just they've sung his praises to the sky. So he thinks, oh, when it's Cordelia's turn, who I really love, and I want to give the best part of my kingdom to. Well, what is she going to say? And she famously says, "I love you as a child should love her father, no more, no less." And this just stuns Lear. I mean, the earth seems to vanish from his feet. I mean, he is taken down, but worse than that, he is angered, really, really angered. But he tries again. He says in rising anger to Cordelia, "Come, Cordelia, mend your ways. Nothing will get you nothing." And Cordelia says, "No. Why do my sisters have husbands if they think you are, the end all?" So Lear flies into high dudgeon. I mean, he is so angry, and one of his courtiers is a very loyal and faithful servant, Kent, tries to intercede on Cordelia's behalf, but Lear's not having any of it. He banishes Kent from his kingdom and says, "You must be gone, and if you aren't gone within a certain period, I'm going to have you killed." And Cordelia has two suitors. One of the suitors says, "Well, are you going to give the dowry that you'd promised and that a royal princess, your daughter, deserves?" And Lear says, "No. Let her plain speaking be her dowry." So the first suitor, I forget, it's Burgundy or I forget who the two suitors are. Even after you watch this thing 100 times, it can happen. But one is Burgundy, I know. So the first suitor says, to Cordelia, "I'm sorry that you've lost a father. Now you must lose a husband." So he withdraws his suit and disappears. But the second one says that he likes the fact that Cordelia is honest and plain speaking, and so he says, "Yes, I will marry you." He marries her and takes her back to France. In the meanwhile, Lear, as you might expect, things don't go very well. He's made this reservation of 100 knights, but the daughters are not happy about this because, as one says famously, you can't have two commands two armies in the same place. So there's some events, and Lear famously has this fool who's full of wisdom that it falls on deaf ears as far as Lear is concerned. But bottom line is that Lear has a fight with his first daughter, and he says, "Okay, well, I'm going to go back to my other daughter, who's going to be nicer to me than you are, because and once she finds out what you've done, she's going to scratch out your eyes." But unknown to Lear, Regan sends a letter to Goneril telling her what's happened and to not entertain Lear. So when Lear arrives there, his messenger, who by the way, the twist of plot is Kent, who's come back in disguise, is he's in a stockade because he's had a brawl with the messenger that Regan has sent to Goneril against the king. But anyway, so when the king arrives, he finds his messenger in a stockade, and the Duke and Goneril are sleeping. So he in rising anger, he says, the servants say that they're asleep, they shouldn't be. So he says, "No, wake them up right now." He brings them down, and there's this massive fight, and a big storm is coming out. This is probably one of the most famous scenes in the play. This is huge electric storm, and the winds are blowing. It's nasty gale force winds, and rain is coming down. And here's this 80-year-old man. He decides to leave, so he walks out with his fool and his servant, and they walk out in the rain, and the castle doors are closed behind him. This is where an act ends, and it's quite dramatic because this is halftime. This is a scene that happens. So he's pushed out into the cold, and there's an 80-year-old man, as you can imagine, your granddad, out with pouring rain, cold, and not warmly dressed. There's also a side plot. There's the castle that the daughter and her husband are visiting is the Duke of Gloucester's place. Duke of Gloucester has two sons. He has a legitimate son, Tom, and a I'll use the word they use in the play, a bastard offspring, Edmund. Now this is where I think the play loses something, because it plays on stereotypes and cliches. It makes the bastard offspring be evil because, of course, he was illegitimately made, so there's no possibility that he could be good. In fact, he even says in this very famous monologue, he says, "Well, I'm a bastard, so I must behave like one and steal the land that belongs to the legitimate good Tom." In fact, I think it ends, "Now God stand up for bastards." So this is going on. Duke of Gloucester has his eyes plucked out in a very cruel and incredibly difficult scene to watch by Regan or Goneril. And he's also pushed out and says, "Sniff your way to Dover," because there's news that Cordelia, having heard all the things that have happened to her father, has come back to avenge, to restore her father and to avenge what's happened to him, and bring an army to restore Lear from France. And they've supposedly landed at Dover, so they're all headed in that direction. So little plot twist: Tom, who's been betrayed by his brother, in fact has been cast out by his father, who's now blind, walking to Dover. He meets his good son and doesn't know that he's his son, but he sees him safely down to Dover. Lots of things happen, but in the end, although Cordelia's armies prevail, Regan, Goneril, one of them actually, I can never remember which sister is which, but either Goneril's or Regan's husband comes over on the side of Cordelia, and in fact they prevail. But while this is happening, the king is taken, Cordelia is captured, and an order signed by Edmund for the execution of Cordelia is carried out, and by the time Lear finds her, Cordelia has been hanged and she's dead, and there happens a scene, the where Lear walks to the very last scene. He walks, you know, with the thought of this is making me cry. With his dead daughter, and he also dies. So that's how it ends. There was some debate that perhaps they could have had a happy ending for this. That Cordelia could have ruled with Tom, and Lear would have seen out his days in the end. But I don't think that would have been as effective as the ending of this play is. So why is it that you feel sympathy for Lear, who's obviously is a piece of work? He's narcissistic. He's his ego is out of control, and of course, being king, you can understand that. But yet, you feel like this man. So when the play starts, he's an old man, but he's fairly robust. He's stands straight. He's tall, and you can tell that here's an 80-year-old man, but he's still physically relevant. But you know that this is an old man, and as it goes on, this age and madness seems to catch up with him, and that's what makes this play work and why it's sad. So that's King Lear for you. If you're a student studying King Lear, I think that's a fairly decent synopsis. You could write your paper on it. But more than that, I recommend that you watch Lear. So before I go, I just want to tell you how I found out about Lear. The very first time. I mean, I knew the play existed, I hadn't read it yet. I found a book, a used book. I bought it. It was Burmese or Burma Stories by George Orwell. It had essays that George Orwell had written and put together in his paperback. One of the essays was on King Lear, and it was about King Lear's views on women, because women are his main tormentors in this. His two daughters, this very famous line. I'm going to screw this up, but sharper than a child's ingratitude is a serpent's tooth, or something to that effect. Well, that comes from here, and he is really persecuted by these two daughters. So in this essay, George Orwell talks about the view of women in this play. That kind of triggered my interest in this play. And then later on, when I was a freshman in university in Texas, of all places, we had to take an English lit class. And that English literature class, one of the set texts was King Lear, and we had a wonderful teacher. And so we studied Lear with him, and at the very end, they showed us a production of Lear. This is a famous production with Laurence Olivier playing Lear, and a whole bunch of famous people cast. So after that, I was hooked, and I was reading this, and in fact, writing about it, and all sorts of things. But anyway, I hope you enjoy King Lear. And more than that, I hope that you survive and thrive and come out of this pandemic on the other side well and happy. Thank you.